Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. We've been hearing some amazing conversations today from some brilliant minds, and we have 4 more brilliant minds on stage here. So we are going to bring this conversation a little closer to home, focus on our nation's great capital. I'm going to introduce our panelists here. So we have the Honorable Bob Walker, former chairman of the House Space and Science Technology Committee, representing the great state of Pennsylvania, and currently CEO of Moonwalker Associates. Carissa Christensen, CEO and founder of BryceTech. Patricia Cooper, CEO and founder of Constellation Advisory. And then, of course, Scott Pace down there. You look a million miles away. Hello, Scott. Good morning. Scott is the former executive director of the National Space Council, and he's currently over at GW running their Space Policy Institute for the Elliott School of Business of International Affairs. That's a mouthful. All right, well, good morning, everybody. I think the first thing we'll do is just kind of go down the line here, and from a policy perspective, give me what you think the state of space is as we work our way through 2024.
Well, I think that the space at the present time is healthy. I think it's very dynamic, and I think that we are getting ourselves into a position of seeing space in a more holistic sense than we have in the past. And so I'm very pleased with where we are and where we seem to be heading. I think we need to figure out how to look at space more dynamically within our economy, but I think we're headed down the road toward a space future that looks very bright because we finally integrated the commercial side in it to be a partner with the government.
I remember the days of public-private partnerships. Nobody even could say it. You know, PPP, how are we going to refer to it? And now it just seems to roll off our tongue. So well said. Carissa?
So the state of space in 2024, record-breaking launch rates. We've gone from 10 years ago, 1,000 active satellites on orbit to 10,000 active satellites on orbit. Growing government budgets year over year in recent years, national security and civil in the US and in many nations around the world. So you have and north of 50 billion in venture investment, plus significantly additional investment at the corporate level over the last decade. So in many ways, I think we're at a high point in space activity. In 2024, I think there are 2 things about the state of space that are worth paying attention to, where the behavior of the international community of space actors and non-space actors is going to affect the US space enterprise. And those 2 are, first, the performance as an entity, as a business of Starlink. Starlink has helped drive that launch rate, has been a significant contributor to our evolving manufacturing industrial base, and is also increasingly, in a number of ways, integrated into our national security enterprise. So how does Starlink play out? How do customers around the world respond to Starlink? And what does that mean for that business, the next generation of that business, and potentially as a bellwether for other large broadband constellations? The second international phenomenon that I think is really relevant in 2024 is coalitions and partnerships around US civil space activity and military and intelligence space activity. There has been a lot of laying the groundwork for those partnerships, and we are starting to see more real activity. And by real activity, I mean budget commitments by other nations to those partnerships and more concrete commitments by US national actors. And so I think that's going to be an important part of 2024, the state of space in 2024.
So I agree that we're at an inflection point for 2024. I see, well, it's not been that long since we were all lamenting a certain stagnation in space. Access to space was difficult. Access to capital wasn't where we wanted it to be. We've certainly moved beyond that to an innovation in manufacturing, an access in launch, an access to capital, maybe a more sober access to capital now than the boozier days of 2 years ago. But we're at the beginning of the space future we were hoping for. And I think that's fantastic. What I see, primarily outside of the space industry and the sort of adjacent policy world, is a certain freak out because it happened faster than we thought. Some of it has to do with Starlink, as someone who was inside there to watch it unfold, certainly faster than anyone thought. But the realization that space is potent as an economic driver, that it's important throughout the sort of functioning of society, is something that's coming to awareness maybe faster than many thought. And it's creating a certain hysteria, skipping over what I think we're in, which is the beginning of the golden kind of era of space possibilities. So moving to that hysterics removes a certain accountability, which is we need to enable that future with the right tools, the right environment, the right sensible policies. And we in the space community are the cooler heads. We're the ones who need to remind ourselves that there are kind of obvious and in some cases debatable but clear tools and paths and resources that we can build to make that next phase of space innovation and development much more successful, much more sustainable, much more available globally. And that is our responsibility, I think, now. So I'll consider us to be in our enabling era.
So I agree with what Bob said about the better integration of space across all the sectors. Certainly national security and commercial and the civil and scientific communities. And so looking at space and national power as something that has these different facets to it, but it's all part of the same industrial base, it's part of the same country, part of the same technologies, has many overlapping challenges. What's been good in the last several years, in addition to getting the kind of reality that we longed hope for, that is now occurring, is we also have, I think, gotten a better alignment of our policies with external realities. The Cold War is long over. We're not in a race with the Soviet Union with just two countries. We have a much more globalized space environment. Many more countries are involved. Much more democratized environment with all kinds of people and private sector capabilities and even university capabilities that are out there. So a lot more players in that environment, and I think our policy is actually adapted and adopted to that reality of international and commercial partnerships. And therefore, the policies across civil, military, and commercial world, lots of problems with implementation, lots of details to argue about, we could spend hours on, but the basic elements are much more direct, stable, and I think sustainable, to borrow the word, than we've really seen in really previous decades, really since really the Apollo program. So that's the good news. The other part of the good news, I should add on to it, is that this is with largely bipartisan support. There's an old joke in the space business, what makes the rocket go up? Funding makes the rocket go up. What makes funding go up? Bipartisan support. And so the fact that we went through a transition between two administrations that you could not imagine to be more diametrically opposite of each other, but that in fact the commonality that was preserved through that transition, Artemis, Space Force, support for commercial, again, you can argue lots of details and implementations, and I can bore people with those details, but the fact that the general direction went in that, stayed the same, was I think a massive relief, and was a reinforcement of the fact that policy is aligned with larger national interests. It's not tied to any particular party, personality, or group of individuals, but it's largely in the national interest that we're now working on. So I like to say, making America great, that we can all agree on. The other joke is that in this town, given how bad everything is at many levels, the two things people agree upon is space is good and China's a problem. And that, while that's a little tongue-in-cheek, the fact is space does represent this very positive, hopeful future. It is something that is unifying, to the, I think, across our culture, whether it's politically, economically, that plays this very, very central role. The caution, not necessarily bad news, but the caution is it's all now about really execution. How does Starlink work out? How do we work with other countries? Do we, in fact, implement and execute Artemis, on time, successfully? Does, in fact, the Space Force get the capabilities it needs and is present? There's lots and lots of these issues. So it's not a policy question. It's like many businesses, it's execution, execution, execution. And so those are the challenges for us. Thanks.
We got to create good policies so we can execute. But so I guess I'll say, in summary, with all four of you, space is moving fast, and we need to be aligned. So see, Peter, that's just a summary because I'm trying to keep space simple. Because when you said space is simple, I thought, oh, no, it's not. So I'm going to make it complicated. And just news alert here, 2024 is an election year. So we have some elections coming up. So I guess I'll turn this over to you, Chairman, and maybe Scott, you can weigh in on this as well. But how do you think we will see space be an impact or maybe a campaign platform, or should it be?
Well, I think we need to understand that we've come a great distance in recent years, and now we need to find ways of putting all of that together. It seems to me that the policies need to develop around the idea that we have broader financing and we have broader international cooperation in a lot of areas. And so as we look toward the future, we need to put plans into place that take advantage of those opportunities in front of us. I think that the idea that much of the money now going into space comes from the investment community, comes from the commercial sector, is a wholly positive thing, because the money coming almost purely from government, as it has in the past, meant that we were dealing with the vagaries of the budget process. And now we have a broader reach to assure that we get a dynamic program, but one that also assures that we meet our national strategic needs.
So I again agree that having more private money and so forth kind of comes in. Not only is that good for dynamism and picking good projects and so forth, but it's also important because the federal budget, I know it's a truism, it's in crisis, and it's been in a crisis, for a geologic age. But nonetheless, it's true that mandatory spending, spending interest on the debt and so forth, is really crushing discretionary spending, particularly non-defense discretionary spending. And so the room for maneuver is much less. One of the things I have students do is calculate how much of the federal budget was discretionary in 1964, 1984, and today. And of course, they're shocked by how much less discretionary budget there is. Okay, what's the proportion of the budget that's available for space within that declining discretionary spending? And again, shocking about how it's crushed. And so the macro conditions for continued year-over-year increased growth in government budget spending is not great, and one should not bet the farm on that. So when we did Space Policy Directive 1, talking about going to the moon and Mars and international commercial partnerships, the very next thing we did is we recognized that we were not going to be spending 1% of the GDP on space, which we did in 1964. That will never happen again. And that we had to basically reform regulations. We need to unleash the private sector. We need to streamline regulation. It's a continuous process. It's not a one and done. So the policy directions we want, the reactions to international and commercial partnerships that we think are wholly positive, we also need to produce a regulatory environment both at home and abroad that's supportive of that and unleashes that. And that's again, another generation of implementation that we're going to be working with. Again, hopefully on a bipartisan manner.
I think there's no doubt that every single one of us in the room would agree that the budget for space is far too small. But it is interesting because we used to correlate that budget to just what the NASA budget was. But now there's so many players in the budget for space that hopefully it starts making that number get bigger and bigger every year. So Patricia and Carissa, I will turn this over to you, but we've talked about so many impacts that space has had. What do you think we're going to see in 2024 as far as space impacts and how it might drive policy going into the year?
So I'm excited by a theme that Peter, I think, picked up on, which is not so much the applications that we all know about that space is well suited for. I do think that's been one of the drivers for example, the wave of constellations. We know now that there is a strong demand for certain services that are well suited for low Earth orbiting satellites. What is not known is what's the next cool idea to utilize that capability that's not in existence today. And I heard the comment about satellite television shrinking. And I recall that that's not that old of a technology. It was a novel technology at one point that no one had thought of and rose and now is being, kind of through competition with terrestrial, phased out. But I think that next wave of demand drivers, coupled with part of our responsibility to make sure that those case studies of how space is useful can be better sort of taken on board by governments and policymakers and governments and individuals. That's, I think, the next wave. It's creating new demand that drives then the business cases, the funding pitches, the manufacturing and launch, and eventual deployment of the space projects that we're seeing. So that's exciting to me. And I'll give you a couple hallmarks to look for. One of them was John Deere just did a huge deal to use satellite for precision agriculture on all of their equipment. We haven't thought about that before. I really like the idea of using the Earth intelligence information for unexpected purposes. And I was talking to a health professional who says that information about how moisture is evolving can give them about 6 months advance notice on pandemics, because they can tell how certain diseases behave in more humid conditions. So these are the things that I'm excited about. It requires us to talk about the capabilities to communities that we don't often talk about. And maybe it's the conference next door, maybe it's other fora. I think the UN has a good role to try and connect our communities. But demand drivers and building new demand is super exciting to me.
So a very policy answer, hearkening to the first excellent panel on the space economy. We, the U.S., have established, the Bureau of Economic Analysis has established a space account to measure the contribution of the space industry to the nation's GDP. That's very important from the point of view of you manage and prioritize what you measure. And we are seeing that now extend globally. ESA is looking at this. The OECD developed a process for states to use. Dr. Claire Jolly there, and in the US, that effort was led by Dr. Tina Heifel. Really, I think, important as a institutionalization of space as a policy priority. Taking a global perspective, the actor that I think is one to watch in 2024 is India. India had a record-breaking year in terms of missions in 2023, seven missions, including a successful landing on the moon. 12 missions on the manifest for 2024, including a test mission for a planned 25 human spaceflight. So that's extraordinary by any measure, an extraordinary set of achievements and an extraordinary ambition to be become one of the tiny group of nations that has conducted human spaceflight.
I think it's a very important point because, I mean, what we have to do in space at the present time is look at it more holistically. And I'm afraid that that hasn't been the case in a lot of government. Scott was part of the Space Council, which was certainly very dynamic at the time that he was there, and hopefully will continue to be, because pulling all of these pieces together is extremely important for us as a country. But it's also important that the world recognizes that you can't just see it in pieces. And too often in the political realm, we tend to see space as, well, that's NASA. Or if you're on the military side, that's Space Force. Well, the fact is all of this has to be done in a sense of what is the total effort that's being put forward. The rockets that are built for NASA can be used militarily. The military rockets can be built and used for NASA. I mean, the technologies are ubiquitous in many ways. The applications, though, demand a sense of strategy. And I'm afraid at times that we haven't been able to use a strategic sense that is holistic in what we plan to do.
I love it. I'm a big team player, growing up as an athlete, and somebody just recently testified in your old hearing room, and you know, everybody always breaks space out into these different compartments: commercial, civil, military, and this individual said space is one. And I think that's a good message to remember. But it's great you brought in the global aspects. So Scott, you come from the academia world, Elliott School of International Affairs. So can you tie in, you know, of course, bringing it back to policy, can you tie in how we really wrap our arms around the global community? We have 34 countries as part of the Artemis Accords. What does that really mean?
Well, sure. So a couple different answers to it. People ask, like, you know, what am I doing? What is the Space Policy Institute doing in the School of International Affairs? You know, why aren't I in the engineering department or someplace else, or even the public policy school? And the answer is, I think our location is great because space grapples with a lot of issues that are important to international affairs, which is interactions of countries beyond traditional sovereignty. So the high seas, the air above the high seas, Arctic regions, cyberspace, things that are beyond traditional interaction. So what you're seeing in space and space governance across civil, commercial, military areas is how states and other powers, non-government organizations and industries, how they're interacting with each other and shaping the world and the flows of international power. And space is one of these great teaching tools that allows you to see these kinds of things. I would say that a lot of the issues that the UN and other groups are dealing with now, they're finding themselves in a reactive mode, whether it's because of mega constellations, whether it's because of debris. There's a time when a lot of these groups were fairly sleepy. ITU certainly gotten everybody's attention and exciting over the last couple of years. They realize where that action is. But in a lot of other non-radio spectrum issues, the international organizations are in this reactive mode. They're realizing how space is important for their missions, food and agriculture, refugees, climate change, all the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You can see space contributing to all of that. But as institutions, they find themselves, I think, somewhat overwhelmed. They don't have the capacity to deal with it, trying to understand it. And so that leads to, I think, what Patricia was talking about sometimes kind of a hysteria of like, you know, stop, please, you know, quit giving me new things to think about. And that can produce, I think, really some unproductive outcomes. And so I think from an international policy standpoint, I think it's in the U.S. self-interest to work with other countries in things like the Artemis Accords, in regulator-to-regulator discussions, to actually build capacity and understanding among other countries. And this is profoundly, I would argue, in our self-interest. It's not foreign aid or charity or anything. Space is vital to the United States. Everybody gets that. But we don't control it, and we can't control it the way we might control other domains. You know, put a fence around it, put a flag on it, or whatever. It's not susceptible to that kind of control, yet our vital interests depend on it. So one of the ways we can protect our interests is to persuade other countries voluntarily to align with us, to join with us on common projects, commercial projects, scientific projects, common military projects. We talk about like-minded countries. And, so it's getting that kind of voluntary shaping, getting that voluntary buy-in is why things like, norms of behavior and best practices, using multilateral organizations, all those things are important because we want to shape the space environment to be conducive to the interests of the United States, the interests of the West, the values, let me be more academic, the values of the Enlightenment, rule of law, human rights, democracy, the market economies. There are going to be other countries out there who don't share those values. Okay, they have a right to use space. It's the province of all mankind. But I don't want them out there shaping that environment without me and my friends and my values. And so that's the sort of, to my mind, is the kind of the stakes we're at and why we're engaging in all these efforts at different international levels, why we need to help shape the international community, because it's vitally in the interest of the United States to do so.
Well, let's pretend, Carissa, that you can control it. Given that power, I'll grant it to you right now, what is one thing as we go into 2024 that you would change from a policy perspective to have an impact on space?
Adequate budgets. We could pull that thread all day long. So, and then very specifically, adequate budgets for regulatory functions. It is ridiculous, the budget dust amount of money that we're fighting over to appropriately fund regulatory actors in the U.S. that need to step into leadership roles and build relationships internationally to address issues from the pace of launch activity and enabling that, to space traffic management, to managing debris. So as unglamorous as it is, I would fix that.
All right, well, I'm a team player, so I have to give all of you that power. So, okay, Patricia, what would you change?
Well, I'm a regulatory girly, so I love giving more attention to the tools that regulators have and policymakers have. And I think that's a great next step. I would turn it to the building blocks that are needed to make good policies. And that means, of the 90-some countries that are involved in space now more than ever, there are lots of baby space regulators where we have an opportunity to help with capacity building and make sure that those agencies are well-grounded in technology and the policy trades. I think we don't have 10 years to wait for the next long-term sustainability guidelines at the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. We don't have that anymore. So how can we accelerate that? We don't have 10 years to debate what agency should do what here. We need to focus on the next steps. I am encouraged by the use of big data and cloud computing to try and solve problems that regulators care about. For example, where are you and what are the risks in space? I see the services, Peter, that you mentioned, but also Slingshot using cloud computing and dashboards to be able to translate a complex space environment into actionable decisions. I'm encouraged by the work of the European Space Agency to study automated collision avoidance, and I think NASA is starting to do that too. And I'm also encouraged by projects like MagnaStar, which is using cloud computing and big data to look at spectrum interference in a multi-stakeholder. If you've got Amazon Kuiper and Eutelsat OneWeb and all the other systems using the same frequencies, how can you make sure they all can coexist? So all those tools are in process. Regulators don't have access to them because they've never budgeted for this. It certainly wasn't ever a line item. So those tools are important. The capacity building and the access to our next generation tools, important for governments to be able to access to.
So back on the theme of working with the international community, I think there is a tendency among a lot of countries as they're seeing these issues coming up is, well, all we need is a new treaty. If only someone wrote a new treaty, all the rules would be clear and we could all obey them, whether they be security related or even commercial related or whatever. We need a new treaty. Basically that's not going to happen because there's no way, it takes too long, doesn't get there, wouldn't pass the Senate. So there's a sort of a slogan in the military of no one's coming, it's up to us. And that's kind of the situation, here. And it's not a form of cynicism, but basically it says we should be developing these best practices. No one's coming. It's up to us. We should then take these into the international community. We should go into the UN and other organizations and basically help with education and capacity building. If it's a word, multilateralize or get people to understanding it, but then come back to national law and regulation. I'm not in favor of some UN superorganization, not going to happen. I'm not going to give up sovereignty to some other grouping. But I at the same time want to engage, and I think it's in the US interest to engage in the international community, expand that understanding, do it bottom up from the people who actually do this stuff, gain common consensus as much as you can, then bring it back to national and sovereign administrations. But now the second part on those administrations, yes, the regulators need to be properly funded. They can't do their job if they can't get data and so forth. But at the same time, there's a larger debate about the role of the administrative state, of the role of regulation. And, apologies to the lawyers here if you've never heard of the phrase, Chevron deference, good for you. But one of the things here is one of the bigger challenges regulation is going to be the role of the Congress in more specifically authorizing and providing authorities. We have a lot of regulators, you probably know them, who are doing things that they think are in the public interest, but for which they have no congressional legislative authorization whatsoever. And Supreme Court cases have beat that down, and it's not a matter of just like, we'll make it up and trust us to do our best. That really isn't going to continue to fly. And it's true, I think, in the space area as well. So the challenge here is actually to have the Congress engage more in terms of what regulatory powers they want to provide, what they don't want to provide, and make those decisions. And I know that sounds daunting, but because if the Congress does not do that, regulations that people do come up with are going to be challenged in court, they're going to be struck down, and they're going to be there's actually going to be more chaos rather than less. So as I said, no one's coming, it's up to us.
I think the fine gentleman here to my right knows a little bit about authorizing. So I think I will yield the balance of my time, sir, give you your reign back, and why don't you close us out because I'm getting the wave in the back of the room.
Well, the fact is that one of the problems going forward will be too much authorization. I absolutely agree with what Scott is saying, that we need to understand what it is that the government can do best and keep it in that area. But here's the problem. We have seen space as a series of projects. The project to go to the moon. The project, then the moon was abandoned in order to do the space shuttle. And we have done this in kind of a serial way that has not utilized the opportunities that we have to use space as a part of the entire economy. I'm a little worried by the political establishment that doesn't see the fact that having the commercial entities involved is actually a great thing because it provides more resources that don't have to be provided through the federal budget process. And so if we can figure out a way to look at space as a place where we can expand the economic opportunities for the country and ultimately for the world by doing things that give us a broad sense of perspective. I think that space will be a dominant part of the economy of the future.
I feel like we should all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Thank you guys very much. This has been a great panel. It's gone by so fast. It's a small room, so I think you guys have time to stick around and we can kind of open this up to you folks here to ask them some questions. But it's been an amazing morning, so thank you all very much. I think we've all probably learned a lot today, whether you're looking at space from a global economy perspective, an AI perspective, and thank you to Rob because I learned a new word today, petamite. I thought it was like a breakfast appetizer or something, but I'm going to go look up exactly what that is. And of course, hearing about space from a regulatory perspective, space is everywhere. It encompasses everything that everybody does in every day of our life. And I think somebody said it earlier today, it starts now. It starts with us. I think every single one of us can have an impact on space, and we are all responsible for incentivizing that next generation of what space is going to bring to us. So I hope we all feel that responsibility. Here at the Space Foundation, we want to bring you all together so that we can help share that need together. So thank you for being here today, and have a great rest of your day. And I don't know if we still have AIA in the room, but I hope this panel was much more informative than the one he's about to head off to, Eric.